Hi, welcome to another episode of MYD Global. I'm your host, Leanne Hackman-Carty. In today's episode, I speak with Monica Sanders. She's a lawyer, a professor at Georgetown University, and a director at the Bill Anderson Fund that specifically supports students of color and getting them more involved in the whole area of disaster science. So stay tuned as I talk to her about some of the great work they're doing, in particular, how they're hoping and trying to make sure that no citizen, no community is left behind. Hey, Monica, welcome to the show, and thanks for taking the time to speak with me today.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here, and thanks so much for the invitation, Leanne.
So before we get started on the topic, can you just tell me a little bit about your background? What your previous work has been, what your research is involved, just a little bit about yourself.
Sure thing. So I am a native of New Orleans, Louisiana. I was in the city in 2005. That was actually the year I was to begin law school. My family, friends, my community was impacted by Hurricane Katrina. The community in which I grew up in is a historically Black community in a part of the city that is not historically Black, so it has a unique tradition. And post-Katrina, we engaged in a decade-long fight to keep our community from being gentrified out of the recovery. There was an intentional effort at exclusion with respect to the Broadmoor community. That altered my vision of how I wanted to practice law. I went into it thinking I was going to do international law and do all this sovereign representation, and it was going to be just grand. I ended up beginning my career in Congress, working specifically on the Committee on Homeland Security, which of course has oversight over FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency in the United States. I know some of our audience might be Canadian, and so I'll be careful about the acronyms as we go forward. I spent the time on the Hill working on disaster recovery. And obviously, coming from a marginalized or a distressed community, I approached that with a particular focus on people who don't have the same amount of agency in terms of participating in public life, who don't come from a socioeconomic status where they can recover as quickly as some other communities can, and also that have other limitations, social marginalization in terms of immigration status or limited language issues, or coming from a native population, which here in the United States, they're treated as sovereigns, but not treated with the same respect as other sovereigns, which adds some complications. I spent 5 years on Capitol Hill doing that work. And then I had the opportunity to go and work in international services at the American Red Cross, which gave me the opportunity to have some operational experience in large-scale complex emergencies, such as what we are seeing in the Middle East and in the African continent, to large natural disasters. One of my first statutory meetings was when Typhoon Haiyan happened in the Philippines. I also worked a lot on Haiti. And again, I also did the Puerto Rico response, the first one for Hurricane Maria, not the earthquake response, although I've been monitoring that very closely. I began teaching as an adjunct lecturer about, I think it's been 4 or 5 years ago now. And when I had the opportunity to become a full-time faculty and research full-time, I made the decision that I was going to focus on distressed populations, but also looking at it in the larger context of the conversation we're having about technology. And as we start to incorporate different technologies into disaster response and recovery, how to make sure those communities are best served by these advancements.
That's awesome. So you work with the Bill Anderson Fund. Can you just explain a little bit about what the fund is, how it was started, what it does?
Yeah, absolutely. So Bill Anderson, or is how it's commonly known as the Bill Anderson Fund. William Avarette Anderson was a researcher in disaster science. And his wife tells the story of him going to conferences, doing consultations abroad and in the US, working for the World Bank and the National Science Foundation. And she says whenever he would come home, he would hold up 1 or 2 fingers. And what that signified was how many other people of color were in the room when decisions were being made about efforts that would disproportionately impact people of color. When he passed away in 2013, Mrs. Anderson made the decision to dedicate part of his legacy to improving the number of people who have access to education in disaster science, practice, and research. And so the William Avarette Anderson Fund for Hazard Mitigation and Research, or the Bill Anderson Fund, was founded in 2013 as a nonprofit. And then in 2018, it became housed in the University of Delaware. And that's where it resides today. With the same mission, we have 38 fellows in every discipline from hard science to law, as well as 21 alumni who are teaching in such universities, University of Minnesota, we have people at University of Florida, Stanford, a number of well-known and well-respected research institutions.
So can you explain to me some of the things that they focus on? Because you know this area of disaster response recovery well, and so someone who may not even be familiar, they might say, well, why is this unique? Why is this area different than other areas? Can you kind of comment on that?
Absolutely. So because they come from all disciplines, they have a number of different focus areas, but what ties them all together is the focus on distressed communities. So for example, Native American communities are 10 times more vulnerable to wildfires than other communities. They are 5 times less likely to have the economic strength to recover at the same rate as other communities. So if we're looking at research in terms of wildfires, and one of our fellows is looking at this with indigenous communities here in the United States, is how as an emergency planner or as a mayor or a governor of a state do you account for that? What other things do we know about building mitigation and resilience unique to that community to help the whole community, inclusive of this distressed group, recover at the same rate for the betterment of the entire state? Another student is looking specifically at coastal communities.
Yeah.
Again, because land close to hazards is cheap. In the United States, there are a number of maroon communities. Our legacy is rooted in slavery, and there are a number of communities that were founded by escaped slaves and therefore lived outside of the traditional government framework for generations, many times near coastal water access. Because if you are going to run, a lot of times waterbound routes were easier to navigate, literally, than landbound routes. So you have maroon communities that tend to be coastal communities because of the history of it, because of the cheapness of the land, but it also disproportionately exposes them to sea level rise and other hazards by virtue of being near the coast. How do you create a sense of agency and trust in government in these communities so that they can access recovery funds or participate in planning? Yeah. And then how do you make sure that they have the tools that they need, given this unique background, to appropriately recover in the event of a catastrophic storm?
Right. No, that's great, because often, you know, the visuals you see when a hurricane, a tsunami, situations like that occur, it's people that don't have the means to start with, and then their houses are not built to standard. Mm-hmm. And so it's just they get hit over and over again, and they're the ones least able to defend themselves. And so, you know, just being mindful of inclusiveness and engaging them in what you're trying to do it's smart, but it's so often overlooked. As far as I understand too, you're going to be teaching a course, a study based on, I think, Katrina, 15 years after. Can you comment just how that came about?
Absolutely. One of the things we talk about when we're talking about how to plan is, what do we learn from these events? And what does long-term recovery actually mean? Like, how long is long-term recovery? Hurricane Katrina is still the most documented natural disaster in United States history, and one of the most documented in world history. So in terms of, as researchers, or even as policy writers or planners, we look for consistent data sets. And that's still the event where we have an abundance of consistent data sets and longitudinal studies on what happened to that population, whether you're talking about news interviews, journal articles written, citizen science, meaning video and cell phone video and reporting from survivors of any other event. So if we want to ask the question of, looking back, what can we learn? That is the storm that we want to look at. And so now that we're coming up on 15 years, what that does for us is we could look at members of the population who were displaced during their prime working years and ask questions. How did this affect their long-term socioeconomic mobility? Did it further entrench them in poverty? Did the recovery efforts help them to recover in a more meaningful way and change their life path? Look specific, a colleague of mine wrote a book called The Katrina Children, specifically looking at children who were either babies or at an age of minority during the storm, and did a 10-year longitudinal study of the development of these children who had been exposed to disaster trauma at a critical part of their development and how that impacts them. Because a lot of times when we ask about recovery, we look at things.
Yeah.
Are the highways rebuilt? Are houses back up? Whenever we look at images of a storm being remediated, it's hammers and plywood and gentlemen and ladies in hard hats, and that's our signal that everything's all right. But do we ever ask, is everyone all right?
Yeah.
And so this class is focused on looking at different segments of the population over the course of 15 years, asking, are they all right? And what can we learn from the ones who did recover? And what does that mean for focusing on the next big event that's going to change the course of history in a city or a community? And for the ones who didn't, what else should we be learning from that? So that's what we're teaching. We actually started last night, was the first class.
Good. Well, that's fantastic. I know that that's a really important component of recovery. A lot of times I look at business and economic recovery in my line of work, but it's that mental health piece that is always the one that people don't tend to think about or recognize. And yeah, that recovery, sometimes people never recover from that. I mean, it's just in the back, it changes their life. Like you mentioned, Katrina changed your life, your trajectory of where you wanted to go. And, you know, thank you so much. Is there anything else before we wrap up that I didn't ask about that you wanted to mention?
You know, I think we got everything. I think the other piece of it is that I am so proud to be directing the Bill Anderson Fund and researching this. But what I'm liking about what's happening in this field is there's now an Institute for Diversity and Emergency Management. There are several scholarships. One's at the Natural Hazard Center in Colorado to fund young people who are looking to do this. The Native Fund has a scholarship specifically for Indigenous populations, irrespective of jurisdiction. So some of your audience may be interested in that. There's a lot of effort being put into rethinking the way we think about this and actually financing inclusion. So I just wanted to add that in hopes that someone may be interested in joining us in this work and letting them know that there are actually avenues to support them in doing so.
That's great. And I will put a link in the video description to the fund, and so people can learn more about it, how to get involved, how to support you. And Monica, thank you for the work you're doing. It's really important. Someone like you being the voice of so many who are voiceless, that's phenomenal. So thank you, and take care.
All right, thank you.